the mirror. On the mirror, please.
Thank you. Actually, it only means I can't hold a job. Yeah, so I have an agreement with our interpreters that if I'm speaking too quickly, that I'll have the appropriate gestures. So if I look up there frequently, I'm just looking for validation. Anyway, so thank you very much, and let me show you a few things that hopefully we'll take away from a little bit. Today, I think we'll talk about first of all, a little bit about multi-casualty or mass casualty incident, and kind of build this thing over today and tomorrow through a disaster or scale type of event. And as we do that, we'll try to build a little bit for you what some of the incident management components might look like and how that might work. So I'll start. I can talk. I see it. Can't you? So the first thing will be, when information comes in through a dispatch center, and then collected information. Sometimes we put information there early on, and the resources being sent out will be adequate, and we'll know what to do right away. But not always. Sometimes information may build over multiple phone calls, and identifying early on the kind of resources you'll need to begin to manage an incident may build a little bit more slowly. The first responding units then are going to be those that are going to be responsible to handle the emergency and to size it up. At least my notes here for a moment. When you heard a little bit this morning from several speakers about who's the boss. And I think that's a good question, because I can help build a little bit of suggestions anyway about who the boss maybe should be. There may be a discrepancy between who the boss is and who the boss thinks they should be. But we can discuss a little bit about who might build up to incident management successfully over the initial steps of care. Okay, we're back. So, at this phase, we're kind of at those initial units arriving and the size up or the assessment of the scope and nature of the emergency and extent of it. The next few things we'll talk about here are things that I think are essential to happen during the response to a major incident, but exactly how you do them can vary quite a bit. I'll show you one way to organize the concepts into structure and into action to make them happen. But what I'll have to show you about the how isn't necessarily the only way there is to do it, but I'll show you what I think needs to be there in some components. The first thing will be to command the incident. And that's the first thing of assigning the first boss of the incident. Usually that initial responsibility falls on the commander or the company officer of those first arriving emergency response vehicles. That may be a law enforcement, that may be fire department, it may be EMS, it depends upon the local system. But somewhere in that structure, there will be a company officer or official that will assume initial command of the incident. That person will have to accomplish a few things. One is to describe the incident, identify the hazards, and quantify the casualties early on to begin to ask for more resources. When the first-in companies are overwhelmed because there are more things to manage than that company can do, then they'll need some help. And defining that early is critical. A lot of the compression of time in these events can occur with effective communications. So I think in both today and tomorrow, you'll hear several comments about how communication plays into the response to incident management. And since many of you are from the EOC, I think that'll hit home directly, because you may be that hub of communications to make things happen. So once there is command identified of the incident initially, then what can you talk about? What communications have to happen? First thing will be, of course, among the responding units, so that as companies begin to arrive, they can orient themselves within the incident in a way that it'll begin to manage the emergency. But other things too. If you're going to need more resources, someone has to help that incident commander manage that request. That usually goes through some form of a central ordering point. That may be, again, a law enforcement dispatch center, it may be a fire department dispatch center, or if it's health resources, it may be through a health emergency operations center. So there'll be some kind of a coordinated communication center to help to manage requests for expanded resources. As you go from a local emergency out to a more expanded area emergency, to a disaster, that becomes progressively more important. Finally, though, the communications between the incident, the event occurring in the field somewhere, and the healthcare infrastructure is a big deal, because at some point here, soon to come, you'll have to move the casualties. And as soon as, my first slowdown warning, here we go, as soon as the extent of resources is understood, then communicating that need to healthcare will be important, so that, as you hear from my colleagues earlier on, that the healthcare resources internally can mobilize their personnel, their stuff, and their structure to make room for the casualties. So communication is a big deal, I think, at all levels. The next thing that has to happen is the triage of survivors. And there are a lot of ways to do this. I'll show you an example, but again, there are lots and lots of possibilities, and probably whatever you use now is fine. I'll give you some ideas about what else might help, but the key thing, I think, is to use whatever triage strategy you used to. Because the challenge here is that just at the time that something really, really bad has happened, your personnel will be asked to do something they do very seldom. And that dichotomy sometimes can create a lot of trouble. So triage. The first thing that will do for you is to help to organize the incident. If there aren't enough transport resources, ambulances perhaps, to move casualties right away, then you may need to cohort them for a little while, short period of time, by acuity. Highest acuity to lowest acuity. At least organize the incident so that when ambulances do show up, you can begin to move the ones with highest priority first, efficiently. The idea of primary and secondary triage, I think, has some value in, again, incident organization. No triage scheme is perfect, and we'll make that point even more tomorrow as we explore, what can go wrong in larger disasters. But I think one tool with primary and secondary triage is to use a methodology that the first responder can apply regardless of the depth of medical knowledge. Something that will work to organize casualties initially by acuity, by pretty much anyone who's responding to the emergency scene and assigned to victim triage. Then, once that scene is organized better, and there is some assignment of acuity and cohorting of those patients by acuity, then a secondary triage layer might be used by a more experienced healthcare trained individual, like a basic EMT or like a paramedic or others, depending upon, again, how things work in a local jurisdiction, and apply other methods to begin to sort of decide within each acuity layer who among those needs to go first, and kind of break it down a little further that way. And also, the value of triage is to identify the need for specialty centers, like trauma, for example, burn, or pediatrics. When you begin to assign casualties now to healthcare facilities, it kind of comes down to two major decision points. One is to assign casualties by capabilities of the hospitals, meaning whether they can handle things like trauma, burn, and peds, as examples, and maybe others, but those are good examples. And then by capacity. And as again, you'll hear more, as the event builds and as communication with healthcare facilities improves, those facilities can begin to mobilize internally to help them expand capacity. But they need to know what's going on, so they can begin to work their chains of command and get their resources in line to begin to receive casualties as first receivers. So there is this reiterative communications thing that goes on, so that as the incident evolves and casualties are identified, triage and then transport begins, the destination hospitals can stay informed to know how many are left, what the acuity is, and with ongoing communications begin to accept patients as they can. Now, interesting twist on this is there may be, in an urban environment, there may be hospitals that are close to the incident. And there may be enough casualties that the casualties may themselves self-triage to hospitals, or well-meaning passersby may take them to hospitals. So one of the permutations on this that can be challenging is to think about the close-in hospitals to where the event occurred, and think that they may be getting casualties already that escaped from the EMS system, basically. Again, that's why this communication thing is so important. If a close hospital is already overrun with casualties, we want to know that, so we don't make the situation worse by sending yet more casualties now by ambulance. The transport component now is determined by a variety of things here. The local practices certainly prevail. Transport means can be determined by geography relative to where it is to incident and to facility access. Certainly when earthquakes occur, transportation can be difficult because roadways may be damaged. So what may work well to transport patients to hospitals one day may not after an earthquake, for example. Also, you may want to choose destinations by specialty centers. Toronto is a good example. You mentioned by capacity already. Now, a comment on ground versus air. Again, in this context, we're talking about a local multi-casualty incident where, for example, there may be a bus collision or something like that. Not so much yet the disaster, where you're moving casualties far from the location of the event out to other places to take care of them. The comment here is I suspect that resourcing ground transport probably is an effective way to begin to manage casualties because moving casualties by helicopter requires resources to help manage the landing zones, and also can transport maybe one or two casualties at a time. So I'm thinking that when you begin to initially conceive how to manage larger events, putting together plans to access ground transport probably would be the first priority. And then looking toward air transport as a secondary means of transport. Now, one important exception would be if the need for specialty centers, again, trauma is a good example, is exceeded locally, then air transport to more distant specialty centers makes a lot of sense. So this is at least one perspective on how to prioritize what you think you might ask for patient transport. Now, I think those are the components that have to happen. Let me show you one way to piece those together to help to organize an incident. But this is by no means the only way. So we're going to fill in the boxes here. We mentioned that one of the first things that will have to happen when emergency responders or first responders show up is to command the incident. So you've got to define that boss initially. And I mentioned that boss just might be a company officer of fire, law enforcement, EMS that first arrives. The next thing, while the boss here is beginning to assess the incident and ask for more resources, someone's going to start triaging survivors, and that might be, again, the first responding fire or EMS resources to do that. But concurrently, I think establishing this medical communications coordinator is probably as equally important, because this position now is the one who begins to communicate what just happened and this person's size up to the rest of the world to get more resources there to help them, and to the healthcare infrastructure to get them dialed in, be able to receive more casualties. So the first steps: command the incident, triage casualties, communicate to the world. As you build resources now, as more help shows up and more things begin to happen, you can add more people now to help with triage. That'll be one of the first pushes to happen. You may have to build now a treatment unit if the available resources to transport casualties can't quite get them all off scene early enough, then you can cohort them in a treatment unit and categorize them by their acuity. The communications continues, and now maybe adds someone to coordinate those ground resources, those ambulances. As they arrive, where do they stage, where do they go, where do they line up to get loaded by, with the casualties, now triaged by acuity. So, you've got the boss still, you've got triage happening, you may have to build a treatment unit now temporarily until you can get them all off scene. You're still communicating, and you add one more coordinator now for the ambulances that are arriving on scene and then transporting patients off scene. This is some data from looking at some of our local multi-casualty incidents, anywhere from, we define for this particular study, 4 as the lower limit for multi-casualties, and then we had up to about 11 casualties when we studied this. And the finding here that helps toward thinking about incident management is that the time to the first person off scene didn't vary too much over the size of the incident. That first person off scene got off scene at about the same time, roughly, from the time of the first 911 or 119 phone call. Almost independent, not quite, of the size of the incident. However, the last patient off scene, much more dependent upon the size of the incident. So, as you begin to ask the resources, the problem shifts from triage to transport in organizing what you need and the amount of what you need. So now, you've made your initial push, you got initially what you needed, but it's going to go on for a while, for an hour or 2 or longer. And you may now establish a new set of bosses. You went from the incident commander that might have been, again, a company officer, and now you begin to unify command. Now, perhaps if you weren't there yet, law enforcement may be engaged, fire department may be engaged, more EMS may be engaged, or other specialty units, so that in each of those disciplines will have their own command structure. So you may need to combine those some way. You still need some voice, some one person to command the incident. But that one person will need to blend the disciplines of all the responders into one central voice, but not yet made by just one person who may not have all the necessary information to make decisions. So unifying command means taking various resources, various disciplines, and combining them together into one command with one voice, but incorporating all of that knowledge into the structure. If the event is large enough, it's happening over a variety of geographical areas now, and not just one physical place that you can kind of command by looking at it, then maybe area command may come up. And what that means, you take the various geographical locations, you give them a operations chief or a boss of that site, and then report back then to a unified command at some central location, like perhaps your EOC, as an example. So we'll talk more about that kind of thing tomorrow in sort of like the disaster setting, really. But the concept of building command, building the bosses, as you need more and more resources, goes from that company officer, from the command of the incident, through unified command, and then if needed, through area command. That helps build the concept of how you identify the boss. So then this command structure would make resource requests as they need to. Order what you need and deal with what you get. As more and more things begin to show up, communication will become more complicated. So an important next step will be to build into your response the ability to sustain communications, to talk to each other, to talk to other responding resources, and to talk to healthcare. In more complex incidents, it may not just be a medical response. You may have casualties, but you also may have fire suppression. You may have technical rescue. You may have hazardous materials to deal with. In any case, you may, which goes even more so back to the command structure that can handle all of those technical kinds of things, begin to care for the casualties. As time goes on, triage operation may decline, but transport operation begin to accelerate. And that goes back to that graph I showed you a second ago, where as you need fewer people to identify the casualties and triage them, you can transition them now to help out with those resources there, to help with transport, and to move the casualty off scene. And as it grows to larger proportions, it gets more complex. It becomes even more important now to have that coordination between the incident and healthcare, so you can identify which hospitals are able to take how many more patients of what acuity. Okay, so we built this a little further now. There still is a boss, which now may be a bigger boss, more people. We divided this up now into operations section. As you saw in the previous slide for incident command, there are other functions to make a large incident happen and to make it move along. But the operations part is the hands-on type of operations going on. That's a section. You may have to manage supplies. You may have still triage ongoing, but maybe not. Maybe you're done. And you may have still cohort survivors into hierarchies of acuity until you can transport them off scene, maintaining communications, maintaining coordination of the ground transport units, or air for that matter, and doing that now under a separate group here, kind of for transportation things. So you begin to as you need more and more people, you begin to divide up the workload, so it's manageable. That's the idea. And finally, I think, as you fill in more people, more boxes, now you have, for example, a rescue group, a medical group. You maybe have a fire suppression group in here as well. You add in more components here if you had, for example, air transport. Where is it? There it is. You would add more people there to help coordinate helicopters and landing zones. So you can see, you get the idea, I guess. You can build in this thing now as much as you need, as complex as you need, depending upon the magnitude of the incident and the resources needed to manage the casualties. And, oh, one more thing. So you heard about volunteers or other well-meaning responders to help to make things happen and take care of survivors. Again, we'll get to the disaster thing tomorrow, but in thinking of a large multi-casualty incident, if you have healthcare providers begin to show up and want to help take care of casualties, the dilemma you have is this. On the one hand, you may need their hands and their knowledge and skills to take care of the casualties if they're still being cohorted on scene. But you also want to keep them safe. You heard about that the safety of healthcare providers at an incident is an important consideration. They need to have the training or protective equipment they need to be safe. So where do you put them to do that? Well, you know, in the best world, the best place you can do that is to place them with this treatment unit. The value here is that you are putting them into an operational component that they are closest to doing what they're used to doing, in the sense they are assessing patients and making triage recommendations for further transport. But you're not placing them up here in harm's way of firefighting, rescue, or other close-in operations that require special skills, training, and protective gear to be safe. So if you have this thing built out to a level where you have assigned people to support on-scene treatment temporarily until they can be transported, the survivors can. This is a good place to put those unsolicited, well-meaning and trained volunteers to action and in place, yet keep them safe. Just one example. Okay, and this is a busy slide, but this is the whole picture. And fortunately, you had handouts to stare at for a while, so that'll help. This is the big picture. All we just talked about, but pretty much all laid out into one command structure. Okay, so a word about triage. And again, to keep in context, think about this now still at the level of a large global multi-casualty incident. A bus accident is a good example. You may have 60 casualties, for example, in a large bus. We'll go to the disaster again tomorrow. So one tool is this thing called START, or Simple Triage and Rapid Treatment. There are many triage tools out there. This is by no means anything that is, special or unique. There are others out there. The challenge is nearly all, actually all, of the triage schemes out there have yet to be fully validated in terms of identifying accurately those casualties who are survivable and require higher levels of care effectively. So now, I'm not sure I have time to get to it, but it's in your handout. We studied this scheme once in the train accident in our county a few years ago. It was the first time we had a chance to look at a triage scheme, just happened to be only used, that's all, in an actual operational event. And it was interesting, you know. The numbers are in your handouts, and we can talk about those if you want to as we see each other, you know, around. The way this works is this strategy relies upon physiological parameters. It relies upon breathing rate, perfusion, and mental states. The first tool they have you use is to identify those casualties who can get up and safely walk on their own, and probably have. You know, people will self-evacuate pretty immediately when they're capable of doing so. So you identify the ambulatory first, but then once you cohort them, you re-triage, because certainly there can be buried in that crowd someone who's sicker than they appear. Those who can't get up and walk around voluntarily yet, you'll look at whether they are tachypneic, breathing faster than 30 per minute, whether they are hypotensive, and you do that by palpating radial pulse. That's the best tool. But if you have to wear protective gear, you can look at capillary refill as an alternative. In general, this is kind of saying that they're hypotensive to about 80 millimeters of mercury or less of blood pressure, but that's rough. And then you look for their mental states. Now, the definition here in this strategy is they are unable to follow commands. Now, this is where this particular step is where the strategy tends to begin to over-triage a little because of the interpretation of what that means. When you think about this in terms of Glasgow motor score anyway, you're thinking about someone, when you physically talk to them or stimulate them, they can refer back to you or interact with you in a meaningful way. They may not know what happened exactly. Whatever happened very fast, and maybe they don't know what happened. But they at least can interact with you. When they begin to be unable to follow commands, means that when you look for their response, they may localize pain more or less. That's a big step when you think about it. But it's a Glasgow motor of 5 or less is what this really means. Yet it's interpreted many times differently, and therefore this is the place that this strategy tends to over-triage patients. Anyhow, this is one strategy. Triage tags. These are examples getting more and more complex. The idea here is that this is a tool to use to identify casualties now by a unified and unique number. Each one gets their own number so it doesn't overlap. And by triage hierarchy, acuity, by whatever tool you use. It doesn't have to be START, it can be other things as well. Identifies immediate, delays minor, or whatever terms you're used to using. It helps to categorize in your minds who goes first, who goes next, who goes last, as you get resources. And of course, you can fill in things here if there's time. You can write on these things and add vital signs or whatever you want to do as you manage the incident. But most importantly, it identifies the casualty by a unique number, and it gives them a acuity, visual scale somehow. Now, this is a busy slide, so my intent here is to give you a perspective on secondary triage. In fact, people back for 1 second here and tell you that my perspective here is that this tool is fairly simple to do. It can be learned fairly easily, and it can be applied with relatively little medical background and knowledge. The good thing about that is you can put a lot of first responders in force to triage a lot of casualties using a simple triage tool, even though it has shortcomings. That has value, at least to organize the scene. Now, in disasters, we have a large number of casualties. The rules may change. And again, I'm baiting you. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But for now, this helps organize the scene. Then, my perspective is, at secondary triage, in that treatment unit, you may want to have more experienced people. Now, if your system includes physicians on scene, that's a great place to put them. Because what you want now is this. As the casualty number increases, and you organize the incident by using a simple to apply triage tool with a large number of first responders can use, now you cohort those casualties by acuity, Now you want to know, if you got a whole bunch of people who are red, immediately, how do you know among those who needs to go first? Or, for example, who should go to a trauma center, to a burn center, or a PEDS hospital, or whatever? That's where I think an experienced person doing secondary triage can help to increase the performance of the initial triage tool. So these things, and you can see on your handout, quite a bit you can't slide here, are simply other factors that go into deciding how acute that red patient is. You know, how sick is the sickest? And to begin to discriminate better in using your hospital resources more wisely. Day by day, you know, we send patients, you all do, we do too, we send trauma patients to hospitals, to trauma centers, all the time. And we overshoot by design. We overshoot because we try very, very hard not to miss a patient, a trauma victim, who would benefit by going to a trauma center. So we send a lot of patients to trauma centers who probably don't need to be there. Now, they probably aren't harmed by that, but nonetheless, it isn't good utilization of resources. But we accept that day by day because we can. Our systems support that. As the incident gets larger, or in disasters, now that's a problem. Because if that trauma center is overrun by casualties, and they are having difficulty now resourcing those critical patients you sent down, now there might be harm. So the challenge here is, the very time that you need the best triage is when it's hardest to do. Okay, actually, I may have said this, let me see. Yeah, what a coincidence. This slide disappears from nowhere. Okay, now, we've talked about triage. We called that one treatment unit a treatment unit, but what about treatment? For the most part, and you know, this is, you are probably practicing this day by day as well, there are very few things that probably save lives or decrease morbidity, anyway, in the field in trauma. Most of the time, what benefits patients is moving them forward to the trauma center. However, in this process of managing multiple casualties, if you place your advanced life support resources in the treatment unit, there may be a few things worthwhile doing when you have time, or at least in the course of an ever-progressive positive movement of that patient toward the trauma center, not delaying transport to do these things, but maybe to do them concurrently. For example, under basic life support, maintaining an open airway. That's simple, that makes sense, and it can be done by multiple levels of providers. Spinal stabilization. You know, you saw images of backboards, cervical collars, other devices to help to stabilize the axial skeleton, the skull, the vertebrae, and the pelvis, and the ribs. But this is also a good time to apply a strategy, if you do this, you know, day by day, to do a clinical clearance of the spine in patients who can be safely cleared, meaning that if they are conscious, alert, awake, they can communicate with you, they have no expecting injuries of some kind. If you have a strategy that you can examine a survivor and determine they probably don't need spinal stabilization, backboards, C-collars, that's a good thing because now they can be ambulatory, unless they have fractures elsewhere, of course, but they can help themselves more. So, as much as this is a right thing to do, this is awfully intriguing in larger events, as long as, again, you have a protocol to do it. That will allow you to optimize the use of equipment and your rescue personnel, but not force people on the backboards who may not need them, and therefore force them to be non-ambulatory and require more of you all to move them around. So, again, things to think about. Another thing that is logical is to control external exsanguinating hemorrhage. You can do that by pressure dressings and tourniquets, and that can be done pretty much with training, with basic level training kind of stuff. So you don't need advanced care to do this intervention, and that makes a lot of sense. In terms of advanced life support, probably the only thing that is doable rapidly in a large volume, it's not a large volume, but doing it rapidly might be to do a decompression of a tension pneumothorax. So as you see, the things here that might make a difference in morbidity and median mortality in a large multi-casualty setting from a treatment point of view are actually pretty defined and pretty limited. But I suspect, although I can't prove it, that it is incident management that probably has the greatest impact on reducing morbidity and mortality by moving those patients progressively forward, efficiently, to the right hospitals. So I would argue that although there are things you can do clinically that probably improve outcomes, the way you manage the incident and how efficient you are at it is, I would guess, at least equally important to do. So, the right patient to the right healthcare facility in at least a amount of time, I think it's a strategy. Now, so we talked about effectively adult blunt trauma so far, or at least that's the inference here. And indeed, most of the triage tools out there are built around exactly that. Blunt traumatic mechanism in adults. What about everything else? And to my thought anyway, your guess is there's none. You know, there's nothing else out there that is designed to be a comprehensive yet practical triage tool that will capture all the mechanisms of stuff that can go wrong in a large multi-casualty incident. So, what about multi-casualty burn? That's very likely, and that's a big deal. What about inhalation injury? That might be smoke inhalation without thermal burns, but it also might be a inhalation toxicant. It may be terrorist, it may not be, it may be industrial. But these things don't lend themselves so well to that physiological strategy we talked about. They may very well be tachypnic, but they may survive and do pretty well in spite of it. Adding the layer of emergent decontamination to a multi-casualty incident adds a huge operational burden. It slows things down dramatically. So, identifying casualty survivors who need decon is an important step. If you don't need to do it, don't, because it will add many layers of complexity, many layers of personnel, and lots of time to move forward casualties once you're engaged. If you need to, absolutely, but it's an important decision to make early on. And I think we've already talked about the fact that most of what we have to work with, even for adult blunt trauma, is largely unvalidated scientifically. Okay, so we already talked a bit about this, and let me see, what didn't I talk about here? Pretty much nothing, except maybe the infectious disease here thing is one more factor that is not accounted for by existing triage strategies that are practical, anyway. One word, we mentioned briefly early on that one of the specialty centers you might be considering for casualty transport are pediatric hospitals. There is a version of this START triage called JumpStart that takes into account some of the physiology of children that may be valuable as well. So there is one strategy out there at least that addresses pediatric traumatic mechanisms that may help a little bit. But there are very few that attempt to address that complex problem. And okay. Let me skip this for a bit. Time. Oh, okay. So let me show you very quickly the one incident we had the opportunity to study in Orange County, California, that provided the opportunity to look at the performance of START triage during an actual incident. This was a train wreck back in 2002. Now that's a long time ago, and it took 4 years to collect the data because of all the complexities of doing science the right way. So it took a long time to get this data, but it was unique that we could, and in part we could because this was a commuter train that was involved with a freight train, and as a result, we had a captive audience. They were on a train to go to work. They had no cars. And we had control of the right-of-way here for the tracks. So we are unaware of any escapees from our triage system. In brief, this was a freight train that was very long. This is a freight train. It's very long. That missed a signal. It should have stopped to allow the passenger train to pass by, but it missed that. So they wound up on opposing tracks. and it's a passenger train, commuter train, with 3 cars that had up to 300 people on it. And although both engineers took evasive action to stop the trains, they couldn't stop completely, and the impact was about 23 miles per hour. The shorter passenger train stopped, but the huge freight train didn't, and it hit about the equivalent of 23 miles per hour, pushed the passenger train back about 100 yards. So to give you a visual, what it was all about, there was some derailment, but mostly kind of a partying of the passenger train cars. Here are the locomotives for the passenger train. The lead car here is here. There's the locomotive for the lead locomotive for the freight train. And you can see here the buckling, derailing, and then I'll show you in a second here, telescoping. It's an interior shot, for example, of the passenger train. The telescoping of the cars, one on the other. So again, some visuals to get you an idea. There are a lot of people. We triage up to, we don't know for exactly, up to 300 people. We transported 162. That's the key number. So we move along here to stay on time. What I want to get to is, to give you some numbers as well. So yeah, we transported 162 patients. We had 1 firefighter with a heat stress injury. We used 13 hospitals and 41 ground ambulances, no helicopters. Strike this, that doesn't exist anymore probably. It took about roughly 2 hours or so to move those patients. This is a graphic of the sort of the rate of movement. And what I'm going to point out here is this illustrates what we talked about earlier on. So the red line here is showing you the individual patients triage as red, as immediate. And so they went off scene first, and they were done right about here. More or less linear, it kind of like moved right along. But there were still a bunch more patients to go. The delayed, or the less seriously injured ones, are the yellow. And you can see, as opposed to being linear, it's somewhat hyperbolic. It curves. So it accelerates, the patient rate of movement accelerates as you get further into the fall. So our point was that in the beginning, triage winds up being the person power priority. As you get into it, transport becomes the person power priority. This case illustrates that very nicely as an example. So we used to study this what's called the modified Bax criteria. What this means is we looked at criteria to say who was immediate and who wasn't. How do you define that? Well, we chose this because it looks at both acuity as well as resource utilization. That's an important combination. And let me go to the punchline here right away. So here's the punchline. So the questions were, when you do this triage, remember the first thing you do is identify the walking movement, the green. So you want to be sure that when you identify them, they're pretty much uninjured. What you want there is a high specificity. And we got about 80-some%. When you go to the immediates, you want to identify, you want to be sure to identify them, you don't miss anybody. So you want a high sensitivity. And this number was low, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but the reality was the number was low. So it looks pretty good here, but it's got a broad range here of confidence intervals. So this is encouraging, but it's only a start. No pun intended. So, we had a large number of patients to work with, only a small fraction were triaged as red. So this number is encouraging, but what it tells us is that it's probably on a good track, despite a right thing to do, but this needs more study to confirm. It's a first step, it's a first idea, it's a first look at star triage under operational conditions. And that was kind of unique. It just happened. And I think I'll stop with that one. You have a variety of case studies in your handouts. The purpose of those is to illustrate the concept we talked about here in some real-life situations. So take a look at them. Again, if there are questions, we'll be here for another day or 2.5. Let us know. We'll talk to you. And let me conclude there. Thank you for your attention.